The morning sun cast long shadows across Manhattan's busy streets as Trump's personal driver of 23 years navigated the familiar route he'd driven countless times before. The autumn air was crisp and the city buzzed with its usual energy. The experienced driver, a distinguished gentleman in his early 50s with graying temples and kind eyes, adjusted his perfectly pressed suit as he drove the sleek black vehicle through the city's bustling streets. He was just 3 blocks away from Trump Tower when he noticed the police cruiser trailing behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. After all, he was driving one of the most well-maintained vehicles in New York, and his driving record was spotless. But when the cruiser's lights started flashing, a knot formed in his stomach. Something felt off about this stop. As he carefully pulled over to the curb, he couldn't help but notice how the other drivers slowed down to look, their curious faces pressed against their windows. The location was less than ideal, right in the heart of the city where the morning crowd was starting to gather for work. A small group of people had already paused on the sidewalk, phones discreetly raised to capture whatever drama might unfold. The driver took a deep breath and followed all the proper protocols he learned over his decades of professional service. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, turned down the soft classical music that had been playing, and waited patiently. Through his rearview mirror, he watched the police officer approach, noting the officer's unusually tense posture. Years of experience had taught him to read people well, and something in the officer's approach sent warning signals through his mind. This wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he could sense an approaching storm on a sunny day. The driver's mind raced through recent events. He checked all the vehicle's documentation just yesterday, as he did every morning. The registration was current, insurance up to date, and he personally supervised the car's maintenance just 3 days ago. There was absolutely no reason for this stop. Through his side mirror, he noticed how the officer's hand hovered near his weapon despite the prestigious vehicle and the driver's professional appearance. The morning sun glinted off the officer's badge as he took measured steps toward the car, his face set in a stern expression that seemed out of place for a simple traffic stop. The growing crowd of onlookers added to the tension of the moment. Some had stopped pretending to wait for the bus or check their phones, now openly watching the scene unfold. A young woman in a business suit shook her head slightly, while an elderly gentleman clutched his morning paper tighter, both seemingly aware that they were about to witness something significant. Inside the vehicle, the driver remained calm and collected, though his heart raced beneath his composed exterior. He'd handled difficult situations before. It came with the territory of working for such a high-profile employer. But this felt different. The way the officer approached, the unnecessary show of authority, the gathering crowd, it all pointed to something more problematic than a simple traffic violation. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, the driver glanced at his phone sitting in its holder on the dashboard. Trump Tower was so close he could almost see it. He knew that inside that building, his employer would be preparing for his morning meetings, unaware of the situation unfolding just blocks away. The driver's finger hovered near the phone's emergency contact button, a direct line to Trump's security team that he'd never had to use before. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, but time seemed to slow down as the officer finally reached the driver's window. The air grew thick with tension as the officer's knuckles rapped against the tinted glass. The driver pressed the button to lower the window, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing unease in his stomach. Little did anyone know, this ordinary autumn morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would not only change lives, but would also spark a nationwide conversation about law enforcement practices and racial profiling. For now, though, it was just a driver and an officer caught in a moment that was about to spiral into something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. As the window rolled down smoothly, the cool autumn air rushed into the car. The officer stood there, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his cap, but his stern expression was unmistakable. The driver could feel the officer's eyes scanning the luxurious interior of the vehicle, lingering a bit too long on his face, making assumptions that shouldn't have been made. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp and unnecessarily aggressive for such a routine request. The driver noticed how the officer's hand still hadn't moved from its position near his weapon, despite the clearly non-threatening situation. 23 years of professional driving experience had taught him to stay calm in tense situations, but this felt different. "Of course, officer," the driver replied politely, keeping his voice steady and professional. "May I ask what the violation was?" "I'm certain I was following all traffic regulations." He kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for the documents, making sure each action was clearly visible to the officer. The officer's response came with a hint of sarcasm. "You made an illegal lane change back there." His eyes narrowed as he watched the driver retrieve the perfectly organized documentation from the glove compartment. The accusation hung in the air, both of them knowing it wasn't true. The driver had made no such violation. He never did. The growing crowd of onlookers had swelled, their presence adding an extra layer of tension to the scene. A few had their phones raised, recording the interaction. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the street as the situation began to escalate. "Officer, I respectfully disagree," the driver said, maintaining his composure as he handed over his license and the vehicle's registration. "I've been driving this route for over 2 decades as Mr. Trump's personal driver. I'm very familiar with the traffic laws in this area." He emphasized his position, hoping the mention of his employer would help diffuse the situation. Instead, the officer's demeanor became even more confrontational. "Oh, so you're Trump's driver?" He scoffed, clearly disbelieving. "And I'm the President of the United States." A few nervous laughs emerged from the gathering crowd, but most observers remained silent, sensing the growing tension. The driver took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his professional demeanor. "Yes, sir, I am. You can verify this with Trump Tower security. We're actually just 3 blocks away, and I'm expected there shortly." He gestured toward the iconic building visible in the distance, its golden facade gleaming in the morning sun. The officer's response was to shine his flashlight directly into the car, despite the bright daylight. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The crowd grew quieter, phones raised higher, capturing every moment of the escalating situation. The driver's heart raced, but his voice remained steady. "Officer, I'd like to call my employer's security team before stepping out. They can verify my identity and position." His hand moved slowly toward his phone, but the officer's reaction was immediate and alarming. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his hand now fully resting on his weapon. The crowd gasped collectively, the tension in the air becoming almost unbearable. A few bystanders began making their own phone calls, concerned about what they were witnessing. In that moment, the driver made a crucial decision. While keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, he pressed the emergency contact button on his phone using his thumb, a feature specially installed for situations requiring immediate security intervention. The subtle action went unnoticed by the officer, who was now calling for backup. Time seemed to slow down as they waited, the officer standing rigidly by the car door, the driver sitting perfectly still with his hands on the wheel, and the crowd watching in tense silence. The sounds of the city continued around them, car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway beneath their feet. But at this moment, all attention was focused on this one spot, this one interaction that was about to become much more than a simple traffic stop. The backup units were approaching in the distance, their sirens growing louder, but another call had been made, one that would change the entire dynamics of this situation. In the Trump Tower security office, phones were ringing, and a message was being rushed to the top floor. The next few minutes would transform this seemingly routine traffic stop into a national story about profiling, power, and the need for change in law enforcement practices. Inside Trump Tower, the morning had started like any other. The lobby buzzed with its usual activity, employees scanning their badges, tourists snapping photos of the golden interior, and security personnel maintaining their watchful presence. But that familiar rhythm was about to be disrupted by an urgent call that would set off an unprecedented chain of events. The security officer's emergency line lit up, its distinct ring cutting through the usual radio chatter. The head of security, a former military man with decades of experience, recognized the unique signal. It was coming from the driver's emergency button, a feature that had never been activated before in all these years. "Sir, we have an emergency alert from the car." The security chief's voice crackled through the intercom to Trump's private office. Trump, who had been reviewing documents for his morning meetings, immediately looked up. He knew his driver would never use that signal unless something was seriously wrong. "What's happening?" Trump demanded, already rising from his desk. The security feed showed the location, just 3 blocks away. The chief quickly explained the situation. Their driver was being held by police in what appeared to be an unnecessary and escalating traffic stop. Trump's reaction was immediate. "Get me down there now," he ordered, grabbing his jacket. His staff tried to intervene, suggesting they handle it through proper channels, but Trump wouldn't hear of it. "This man has driven my family for over 20 years, he said firmly. "He's never had a single incident. Something's not right here." As Trump moved through the building, the security team scrambled to coordinate. Through their cameras, they could see the scene unfolding on the street, the growing crowd, the aggressive stance of the officer, the backup units arriving with their lights flashing. The situation was getting more tense by the minute. In the elevator riding down, Trump's mind raced through all the times his driver had gone above and beyond his duties. The countless early morning pickups, the late-night returns, always professional, always reliable. The driver wasn't just an employee. He was part of the Trump Tower family, trusted with the safety of Trump's own children over the years. The security team radioed ahead to their street-level units. "Sir, the situation is escalating," they reported. "The officer has called for backup, and there's a significant crowd gathering. Our driver is still in the vehicle, but the officer is demanding he step out." Trump's jaw set in determination. "How long until we get there?" he asked, watching the elevator numbers tick down. His security detail was already coordinating with NYPD higher-ups, but Trump knew that bureaucracy moved too slowly sometimes. This needed immediate intervention. The lobby seemed to part like the Red Sea as Trump strode through, his security team struggling to keep up with his determined pace. Outside, his personal vehicle was already waiting, engine running. The morning sun caught the golden letters of Trump Tower behind them as they pulled away from the curb. Inside the stopped car just blocks away, the driver remained calm despite the mounting pressure. He could hear the backup units arriving, their sirens growing louder. The officer outside was becoming increasingly agitated, especially after learning that calls were being made to his superiors. The crowd had continued to grow, with office workers pausing on their way to work, phones recording every moment. Social media was already lighting up with early posts about the incident. Nobody knew yet that this situation was about to take an extraordinary turn. As Trump's vehicle sped the short distance, he received updates through his earpiece. The driver was still being cooperative, but the situation wasn't improving. The officer had called for a T9 unit, a clearly excessive response for a supposed traffic violation. Trump's face darkened with each new detail. The distance between Trump Tower and the scene was short, but those few minutes felt like hours to everyone involved. The driver, still seated calmly in his car with his hands visible on the wheel, had no idea that his employer was personally on the way. The officer, still demanding the driver exit the vehicle, had no clue that one of the most influential men in New York was about to arrive. Through the growing tension, sirens, and crowd noise, nobody noticed the sleek black vehicle approaching from the direction of Trump Tower. Nobody except the security personnel on scene, who were quietly spreading the word through their radio channels, "Sir is incoming." 30 seconds out, the morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the city streets as the scene was about to transform from a troubling case of profiling into something that would capture national attention. In just moments, this corner of Manhattan would become the stage for an unexpected confrontation between power, prejudice, and principle. The sleek black vehicle carrying Trump turned the corner with precision, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sunlight. The crowd, which had grown to nearly 100 people, suddenly shifted their attention from the ongoing confrontation to this new arrival. Something about the vehicle's presence commanded attention even before anyone knew who was inside. The officer, still standing by the driver's door with his hand near his weapon, barely registered the new vehicle's arrival. His focus remained fixed on the driver, who had maintained his composed demeanor despite the mounting pressure. The backup units had created a perimeter, their lights still flashing against the glass windows of nearby buildings. Trump's car pulled up precisely 20 feet from the scene. The gathered crowd, sensing something significant was about to happen, instinctively stepped back to create a path. Phones were raised higher, cameras ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl as drivers tried to glimpse what was causing such a commotion. The moment Trump's door opened, the energy in the air changed completely. His security team moved to flank him, but he was already striding forward with purpose, his familiar figure unmistakable. A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. "It's Trump. Trump's here. That's really him." The officer finally turned his head at the commotion, his eyes widening as he recognized the approaching figure. Trump's presence was commanding, his suit impeccable, his expression stern and determined. This wasn't the Trump people saw on TV or at rallies. This was Trump coming to defend one of his own. "That's my driver you're harassing." Trump's voice carried clearly across the street, cutting through the morning air like a knife. The officer's hand finally dropped from his weapon as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The backup unit's radios crackled with confused chatter as supervisors tried to get a handle on the rapidly evolving situation. Trump walked directly to his driver's car, pointedly ignoring the officer's attempt to intercept him. "Are you all right?" he asked his driver through the still-open window, his concern genuine and visible to everyone watching. The driver nodded, maintaining his professional composure even in this extraordinary moment. The crowd had fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. The only sounds were the idle of engines, the occasional car horn in the distance, and the click of hundreds of phone cameras capturing every second. Social media was about to explode with first-hand accounts of what was happening. Trump turned to face the officer, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. 23 years, he said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "This man has driven for me for 23 years. Not a single ticket, not a single incident. What exactly is the problem here, officer?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier aggressive demeanor deflating under Trump's direct scrutiny. The backup unit's supervisors were now approaching rapidly, having recognized the situation had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the tension written across every face. Trump's security team had established their own perimeter, working professionally alongside the NYPD units who were now trying to manage the growing crowd. More people were arriving by the minute, drawn by the social media buzz and the unusual sight of Trump himself standing on a Manhattan street, confronting law enforcement. "I want your badge number," Trump continued, his voice level but firm. "And I want your supervisor here. Now." He turned to one of his security team members. "Get the precinct captain on the phone. This stops right here." The officer's face had gone pale, the reality of his actions and their consequences finally setting in. The driver remained seated in his car, watching through the windshield as his employer of more than 2 decades stood up for him without hesitation. The morning had started like any other, but now he was at the center of what was quickly becoming a viral moment in the ongoing national conversation about law enforcement practices. Trump's presence had completely transformed the dynamic of the situation. The aggressive stance of law enforcement had given way to embarrassed backpedaling. The crowd's nervous energy had transformed into a sense of witnessing something historic. And through it all, Trump stood his ground, making it clear to everyone present that this kind of profiling wouldn't be tolerated, not with his employees, not in his city. The precinct captain arrived within minutes, his unmarked car pushing through the growing crowd that now filled the sidewalks. The morning sun had risen higher, and the golden letters of Trump Tower gleamed in the distance, a reminder of just how close this incident was to home. Trump stood his ground, his presence creating a circle of tense calm in the chaos of the scene. "Mr. Trump," the captain began, extending his hand as he approached. He was a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and decades of experience written across his face. Trump shook his hand but didn't soften his expression. The crowd pressed closer, straining to hear the exchange that was about to unfold. "Captain, I want to know why one of your officers is harassing my employee," Trump demanded, his voice carrying across the hushed street. "This man has driven my family for over 2 decades. He has security clearance higher than most of your department, and yet here we are." The officer who had initiated the stop stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. His body camera continued to record everything, footage that would later become crucial evidence in the investigation. The backup units had killed their sirens, but their lights still painted the scene in rotating blues and reds. "Sir, we take these matters very seriously," the captain responded, trying to maintain professional composure while being acutely aware of the hundreds of phones recording every word. "If there's been any misconduct—" Trump cut him off, his voice sharp but controlled. "There's no if here, Captain. I just watched your officer with his hand on his weapon, threatening my driver over a made-up traffic violation, 3 blocks from my building. This isn't a coincidence." The driver remained in his car, following proper protocol despite Trump's presence. His patience and professionalism throughout the ordeal spoke volumes about his character. The morning traffic continued to crawl past, with drivers slowing to witness the unprecedented scene. Trump himself standing on a Manhattan street, confronting law enforcement over racial profiling. "Look at his record," Trump continued, gesturing toward his driver. "Check his history. Not a single violation in 23 years. He's driven presidents, world leaders, and my own children. And your officer didn't even bother to verify his identity before escalating this situation." The captain signaled for the officer to join them. The young officer approached slowly, his earlier aggression replaced by visible nervousness. The crowd watched in tense silence as he stood before Trump and his superior, forced to answer for his actions in front of an ever-growing audience. "Explain yourself," the captain ordered, his tone making it clear that this was no routine traffic stop review. The officer shifted uncomfortably, looking between his superior and Trump, struggling to find words that would justify his actions. I thought I observed a traffic violation," the officer stammered, but his voice trailed off as Trump held up his hand, pointing to the multiple security cameras on nearby buildings. "We'll review the footage," Trump stated firmly. "Every second of this stop is on camera. We'll see exactly what kind of violation you thought you saw. And then we'll talk about why you really pulled over my driver." The morning had grown warmer, but a chill ran through the crowd at Trump's words. Everyone present understood the implications. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior that had finally been caught in the spotlight. Trump turned to address the gathering of police officers who had responded to the backup call. "This isn't about disrespecting law enforcement," he clarified, his voice carrying authority. "This is about holding people accountable when they abuse their power. My driver deserves better. Every citizen deserves better." The captain was already on his radio, calling for internal affairs to respond to the scene. The officer's body camera footage would need to be secured immediately. The professional requirements for handling a high-profile incident were kicking in, but everyone knew this case would be anything but routine. Through it all, Trump's driver maintained his dignity, sitting calmly in the vehicle that had become the centerpiece of what would soon be a national story. His patience and professionalism in the face of injustice would soon make him an unexpected symbol in the ongoing conversation about law enforcement reform. As the morning wore on, the crowd continued to grow. Social media was exploding with videos and photos of the confrontation. News vans were beginning to arrive, their satellite dishes extending skyward as reporters rushed to cover this developing story. What had started as a routine traffic stop had transformed into a moment that would spark serious discussions about accountability in law enforcement. The next few days at the NYPD Internal Affairs Bureau were anything but ordinary. The office buzzed with activity as investigators pored over evidence from the incident that had now captured national attention. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting dust particles dancing in the air as teams of investigators huddled around computer screens, reviewing footage from every angle. The lead investigator, a veteran with 30 years of experience, sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of files. On her computer screen, the body camera footage played on a loop, showing the entire incident from the officer's perspective. Each viewing revealed new details that made her shake her head in dismay. "Look at this," she called to her partner, pointing at the screen. The driver's hands never left the steering wheel. His documentation was perfect. The vehicle registration was current. And look at the officer's approach. Hand near the weapon from the start. Her partner leaned in, taking notes as they documented each concerning detail. The investigation had expanded beyond just this one incident. As they dug deeper into the officer's history, a troubling pattern emerged. Computer screens displayed spreadsheets of past traffic stops, showing a clear bias in who the officer chose to pull over. The numbers didn't lie. There was a distinct pattern of discriminatory behavior that couldn't be ignored. Down the hall, another team worked through hundreds of social media videos from bystanders. Each clip offered a different angle, a new perspective on the incident. The wall of their office was covered with screenshots, creating a timeline of events that left no room for doubt about what had transpired that morning. Have you seen the security footage from Trump Tower? One investigator called out across the room. The high-definition cameras had captured crystal-clear images of the entire route the driver had taken. There was no traffic violation, no erratic driving, nothing that would have justified the stop. The evidence was mounting by the hour. The precinct captain had ordered a complete review of all traffic stops made by the officer in question over the past year. The data analysts worked overtime, creating detailed reports showing patterns of behavior that should have been caught much earlier. The morning coffee grew cold on desks as investigators found themselves unable to pull away from the disturbing findings. In another room, investigators interviewed other drivers who had been stopped by the same officer in the past. Their stories painted a picture of a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, creating a clear image of systemic issues that needed to be addressed. The media pressure was intense. News vans remained parked outside the precinct, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters called constantly, seeking updates on an investigation that had captured the public's imagination. The story had struck a chord with people across the country, becoming a symbol of the ongoing struggle for accountability in law enforcement. Inside the evidence room, technicians carefully preserved every piece of digital data. Trump's security team had provided additional footage from their own cameras, offering even more angles of the incident. The wall of screens showed multiple viewpoints of the same moment, leaving no doubt about what had transpired. The officers' union representative sat in a conference room, reviewing the mounting evidence with growing concern. The case was becoming impossible to defend. The facts were too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. This wasn't a matter of interpretation or misunderstanding. This was a clear case of profiling that couldn't be explained away. As the week progressed, the investigation expanded to include a review of departmental training procedures. How had this behavior gone unnoticed for so long? What systems had failed to catch these patterns earlier? The incident was forcing the department to look inward, to examine its own practices and procedures. Trump's driver had become an unintentional catalyst for change. His professional behavior throughout the incident, captured on multiple cameras, stood in stark contrast to the officer's aggressive approach. The driver's 23 years of perfect service became a powerful testament to the injustice of what had occurred. The investigation's findings were impossible to ignore. The officer's body camera footage, the security camera videos, the witness statements, the statistical analysis of past traffic stops, everything pointed to a clear case of racial profiling. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving department leadership with difficult but necessary decisions to make. As the sun set on another long day of investigation, the lead investigator stood at her office window, looking out over the city. The incident had forced an important conversation, not just within the department, but across the nation. Sometimes it took a high-profile case like this to shine a light on issues that had been in the shadows for too long. 2 weeks after the incident, the NYPD commissioner stood at a podium in the department's press room. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning as he announced the results of the internal investigation. The officer had been terminated from the force, and the department was implementing sweeping changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Behind the scenes, Trump's driver had returned to his normal routine, handling his duties with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown throughout the incident. But something had changed. Other drivers would stop him at traffic lights, giving him a thumbs up. People recognized him on the street, thanking him for staying calm and helping to bring attention to an important issue. Trump had turned down numerous requests for interviews about the incident, but he did release one powerful statement. What happened that morning wasn't just about my driver. It was about every person who's ever been unfairly targeted. We're going to make sure some good comes from this. The changes began almost immediately. The NYPD announced new training programs focused on preventing bias in traffic stops. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during stops. Traffic stop data would be reviewed monthly for patterns of potential profiling. The incident had become a catalyst for real change. In police academies across the city, trainers now used the footage from that morning as a teaching tool. They showed new recruits how a routine traffic stop should never be handled, pointing out the warning signs and the escalating tensions. More importantly, they emphasized how a single officer's actions could damage the relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. The driver's story became part of a larger conversation about professional dignity in the face of injustice. Management schools started using the case as an example of how staying calm under pressure could transform a negative situation into a positive change. His 23 years of perfect service became a testament to excellence in any profession. Trump Tower implemented new protocols for all their drivers, installing emergency alert systems in every vehicle. The driver's quick thinking in pressing that alert button had helped prevent the situation from escalating further. Now, other companies were following suit, protecting their employees with similar systems. Social media kept the conversation going. The videos from that morning had been viewed millions of times, sparking discussions in homes and offices across the country. But unlike many viral moments that fade quickly, this one had lasting impact. People referenced it when discussing the need for accountability in law enforcement and the importance of standing up for what's right. The precinct captain, true to his word, had overseen a complete overhaul of traffic stop procedures. Officers now had to call in every stop before approaching a vehicle, and supervisors monitored stops in real time through body cameras. The extra steps took time, but they helped ensure fairness and safety for everyone involved. In the months that followed, traffic stop statistics showed significant changes. The number of stops based on minor violations decreased, while the number of legitimate safety-related stops increased. Officers focused on real threats to public safety rather than perceived infractions that could mask underlying bias. The driver himself had become an unexpected symbol of dignity under pressure. When he finally agreed to one brief interview, he spoke not of anger or resentment, but of hope for positive change. "What happened that morning was unfortunate," he said, "but if it helps make things better for others, then something good came from it." Trump's response to the incident had also sparked changes in how other business leaders handled similar situations. Companies began taking more direct action when their employees faced discrimination, realizing that silence wasn't an option when injustice occurred. The incident had shown that speaking up could lead to meaningful change. 1 year after the incident, the NYPD invited the driver to speak at their reformed training academy. Standing before a room of future officers, he shared his experience not to condemn, but to educate. His message was simple but powerful. Every interaction between law enforcement and citizens was an opportunity to build trust or break it down. The changes rippled outward like waves in a pond. Other police departments across the country studied what happened and implemented their own reforms. The incident became a reference point for how a single moment, captured on camera and handled with dignity by all parties involved, could lead to lasting positive change. As the story faded from headlines, its impact remained. The driver continued his work with the same professionalism he'd always shown. Trump Tower stood tall against the Manhattan skyline, and the NYPD worked to rebuild trust with the community. But something fundamental had shifted, a reminder that when people stand up for what's right, real change is possible.